Columbia River was once like a great fish machine. It so teemed with salmon that horses were used to harvest them. The fish were thought to be immortal and inexhaustible.
Only the royal Chinook, instinctively fighting its way upward to spawn, can defy the crashing falls and cascades.
But in the 1930s, the Northwest was an underpopulated region, fighting its way out of depression. Hydropower was seen as the means of recovery. One after another, the Columbia and its tributaries were dammed.
Like a Gothic cathedral, Bonneville rises block on block.
51 dams were built altogether. They closed off more than 4,000 miles of spawning streams above Bonneville Dam. The official line was that the dams were actually aiding the salmon in their passage up the Columbia.
And they find the new passage much easier than the boiling Cascade Rapids of yesterday. The salmon are going through.
The reality was different. Bonneville Dam killed about 15% of the salmon going upstream, and with each new dam, more fish died. The real devastation was to the tiny, newly hatched salmon going downstream to sea. 77 to 99% of the baby fish were killed by turbines at the dams. Today, we have only one fish for every 6 that once swam in the Columbia. The most momentous social adjustment among those who fished the salmon was brought by American Indians demanding their share of the catch. We will tell you of that historic struggle when Salmon's story continues. Indians have been fishing Northwest waters like the gorge of the Klickitat for 50 centuries or more. Today, they still stand above the rapids to hunt silver salmon fighting their way upstream. Yakima Indians seek the Klickitat salmon for subsistence and money, but it is a melancholy business compared to its original splendor.
I'm getting by on it, barely. I'm down here broke right now, so I'm gonna catch me a couple fish. When I first started fishing, we used to fish for 4 months out of the year, June until August, September. Now we get to fish 23 days out of the year, legally on the Columbia.
Salmon, as much as water and trees, symbolizes the bounty Indians once had. Their drive to regain their share of the salmon marks an historic turning point for Indians and whites together. The Indians' position in the region was measured by the dwindling of the fishery. The white men looted the river with fish wheels. Canneries' insatiable appetite drove the fish runs down and down. Dams finally destroyed the tribal fishery at Celilo Falls, once among the most productive in the world. It was only in the 1960s that the tribes realized the scale of their loss. They were told that despite the treaties they had signed in the 1850s, Indians had no special right to fish.
These issues have been in the courts on several occasions, and our courts in this state have held that these Indians have no rights, at least rights of the kind that they assert.
Thus began a struggle as momentous as it was acrimonious. On reservations near Puget Sound, the tribes began to defy the state's fishing regulations, putting their nets in prohibited waters, challenging the authority of the states of Oregon and Washington to limit or regulate Indian fishing.
All that I'm saying is that if this illegal fishery continues, the people that are responsible are subject to arrest, and that's the only course we have.
The Indian assertion of fishing rights was decided in the courts in a way that no one, not even the Indians, had foreseen. A dapper federal judge named George Bolt ruled that salmon were just as necessary to the Indians as the air they breathed.
Judge Bolt concluded that the Indians should get not just a share of the fish, but half. It was more than the Indians ever hoped to win, 50% of the harvestable fish. And white fishermen reacted with bitterness and resistance.
There was a wave of violence. One white fisherman was shot by fisheries agents. Snipers fired on Indians. One Indian was wounded. But the U.S. Supreme Court ended the bickering 5 years later by upholding the Indians' right to half the fish. Prior to Judge Bolt's ruling, the Indians caught 5 to 13% of Northwest salmon. Today, they harvest 50%, and that readjustment has meant the economic death of many sectors of the non-Indian commercial fishing fleet. The non-tribal fishing fleet once numbered 7,000 boats in Washington state. Today, it is fewer than 3,400, a decline of 49%. Most striking, the revenues to tribal fishermen have gone from $6 million a year to $28 million in a decade. Most white fishermen have accepted and even endorsed the Indians' right to half the fish. But there are some who have never fully accepted the historic legal judgment or its consequences. Ross Lindstrom is a third-generation Norwegian fisherman whose family has harvested salmon from the Columbia River since the turn of the century.
When it comes to being greedy and selfish, they make a white man look bad.
Ross Lindstrom was an early and militant rebel against the Bolt decision, arrested repeatedly in the 1970s.
I would never be reconciled to a man cutting my legs off at my hips. Couldn't do it.
Ross, what are you saying to me? Are you saying that the user disputes, all those nasty fights that we saw all through the 70s, that's not over yet?
Hell no.
But what do you mean?
It just started. Well, the Indian thing is the worst user deal. Because the Indian says, well, I got the Bolt decision, I got the right to fish. Well, so he takes that and he uses that as a club to get position where he's got everybody over a barrel.
With the salmon available to them probably reduced forever, hundreds have left the industry. Many have sold their gear to the state in a federally sponsored program to retire unprofitable boats from the fleet. Today, gill netters are house painters and carpenters. Ross Lindstrom has turned to sturgeon fishing. Some are fishing elsewhere.
Most of them are supporting their Columbia River fishing with their Alaska fishing. There's hardly enough money in this fishery to pay for a new net, let alone get enough to take home to live on.
In 1856, 3 tribes, the Hoh, the Quileute, and Quinault, signed a treaty with the territorial government of Washington. Among the signers was the grandfather of this man. 130 years after his tribe gave up vast tracts of land in return for perpetual fishing rights, Jim Harp is a beneficiary of that old treaty. With the surf booming behind him, Harp fishes the mouth of the Queets River as his grandfather did. Harp is now chairman of the Tribal Fish Commission. He first saw the river from a dugout canoe.
We used to be able to make a good living off of this. The last 5 or 6 years, it's not been enough to make a living. I've had to find another job.
A decade ago, tribal officials like Jim Harp were appearing in court dozens of times every year. Today, those appearances are rare.
Every day, there are more and more sport fishermen and commercial fishermen that are beginning to accept it, beginning to say, hey, what can we do together to make it a better resource for everyone?
Indians have been given not just more salmon, they have been given an expanded responsibility in caring for the fish. Today, Indian tribes have 22 hatcheries, which last year put 30 million young salmon into Northwest rivers and streams.